the opportunity to share more information about the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program with DHHL staff and other NHHBG program participants. My name is Claudine Allen, and I'm a Native Hawaiian Program Specialist in the HUD Honolulu Field Office. And I I'm the only person working in our Hawaii ONAP office, but I'm hoping to bring on additional staff in the near future. Today we'll be talking about, I should say that I work very closely with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands to provide them support and technical assistance, as well as oversight for implementing the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program, also known as NAHASDA. And we also, another program that we administer is the Section 184A Loan Guarantee Program, which provides a mortgage financing option for lessees to be able to finance their homes located on Hawaiian homelands. Today, we'll be talking about the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program and some recent regulatory changes that were implemented in March of this year. So what I'll do is I wanted to turn my camera on, at least for the introductions, and then I'm going to turn my camera off while I run the slides. But please feel free to ask questions along the way, or if you want me to go back and explain anything a little further, I'm happy to do that. So welcome to today's session. All right, so what we'll be talking about is the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Final Rule, which became effective March 13, 2024. And the title of the rule is Implementing Rental Housing Assistance for the NHHBG program. The purpose of today's meeting is to provide a briefing on this final rule and go over the changes that were made to the NHHBG regulation at Title 24 in the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1006. So these are the regulatory requirements where they are codified for the NHHBG program. Another purpose of today's meeting is to update awareness for DHHL as well as other NHHBG program participants on requirements for the NHHBG program. And then finally, another reason for today's meeting is for DHHL, after receiving this information and updates, to get them to determine whether their written policies and procedures are sufficient or if they need to make any updates in their policies. So why did HUD make changes to the NHHBG regulation? I want to just give a little bit of background and then explain the main reasons why. So in 2002, the 24 CFR Part 1006, or the NHHBG regulations, was created to implement Title 8 of NAHASDA. NAHASDA stands for the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. So this is the legislation or the law that authorizes the NHHBG program. And normally when a new federal law is enacted, then the federal agency who will be administering the program will create regulations to implement the law. So the NHHBG regulations, when they were initially written, they were modeled after HUD's Indian Housing Block Grant Program, and that program is also authorized under NAHASDA. And the regulations for that program are at 24 CFR Part 100. And so from the beginning in 2002, at that time, the NHHBG program was substantially similar, well, it still is substantially similar to the Indian Housing Block Grant Program. However, since 2002, no comprehensive review or amendments were made to the NHHBG regulation. But in the meantime, there were amendments made to NAHASDA and the IHBG regulations, but those corresponding amendments were not made to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant regulations. And so as DHHL was starting to delve more into considering doing rental housing or rental housing assistance programs, we realized that the NHHBG regulation at Part 1006 did not adequately explain how NHHBG may be used for rental housing assistance. NHHBG has always, from the beginning, has always been authorized to provide rental housing assistance, but the regulation just didn't explain it very well. And so we felt that changes were needed to be able to support a successful rental housing program to be administered by DHHL. So the goals that we had set out for these regulatory changes are to ensure compliance with the NHHBG program statutory requirements. Another goal is to promote consistency between the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant and the Indian Housing Block Grant programs, where the program statutory requirements overlap. And then finally, to clarify the NHHBG regulatory rental assistance framework and thus improve access to rental housing assistance for low-income Native Hawaiian families. And so here provides a URL link to where you can find that printed final rule that was published in the Federal Register. And that's what we call the codified changes to NHHBG. So for the majority of the slides that I have presented, I have prepared for this presentation is to discuss what changes were made to the regulation. And so I plan to go through it section by section to give a general explanation and show where the changes were made. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me along the way. So the first section that we revise is section 1006.10, where you'll find a list of definitions that are used within this regulation. So what we did was, through this final rule, we added several new definitions. We added a definition for annual income. So this term is used in Part 1006, but it was not defined. So prior to us adding in this definition, this annual income term was only described in NHHBG program guidance documents. And so this definition mirrors the way that we define annual income in the program guidance. So for those DHHL NAHASDA staff who are familiar with that, this annual income definition defines for DHHL how they can define, basically we give them the parameters on how they can define annual income, because the NHHBG program is designed to assist low-income families who are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. So before you can determine whether and so DHHL different methods of determining annual income. They can use the Section 8 definition for the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. So the definition that that program uses for calculating annual income is a definition that DHHL could utilize. DHHL could also utilize what we call the IRS 1040 definition of annual income, which is basically your gross adjusted income when you file taxes using the IRS 1040 series forms. And then the third option is to use the Census Bureau's definition of annual income. So DHHL can choose either one of those three definitions or use a combination of those three and come up with whichever definition is most advantageous to the family or DHHL. So it can get complicated, but basically DHHL has a lot of discretion within that definition of annual income for calculating that for families to be assisted by this program. The term income was also previously not included in the regulation. And so to align this NHHBG program with the IHBG and NAHASDA statute, we have now included this term. And basically, we're pointing to the definition of income in the statute in NAHASDA, and that carries over into this program. For the sake of clarity, we thought we would go ahead and add NAHASDA to our list of definitions. And of course, this is the acronym for Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. We also now have a definition for person with a disability. This term is used in Part 1006, but it was not defined. And so we now have a definition for this term, and the definition is consistent with the definition in regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. We also now have a definition for project-based rental assistance, and the purpose is to define this term, which is used in a new section that we created in the regulations, and that section at 1006.227 is called tenant-based or project-based rental assistance. Under the section 1006.101, housing plan requirements, we made some technical revisions just for the sake of clarification. So when we talk about the deadline for DHHL to submit their annual housing plan to HUD, which is called the Native Hawaiian Housing Plan, we've clarified that the plan must be submitted prior to the start of DHHL's fiscal year. Previously, it just said that it needed to be submitted prior to the start of the fiscal year. And so here we're clarifying that it's prior to the start of DHHL's fiscal year. And the reason that's important is because DHHL's fiscal year cycle, July 1 to June 30, differs from the federal fiscal year cycle, which is October 1 to September 30. So again, for clarification, we felt that that was important. When DHHL, in this little or under case C paragraph, updates to the housing plan, we're clarifying that updates to the plan basically means updating the 5-year plan information. So within the Native Hawaiian Housing Plan, there's a section where DHHL provides a 5-year projected plan. And then another portion of the housing plan is the 1-year plan, which covers the upcoming 12-month period. And so each housing plan that is submitted to HUD has to include both that 5-year plan information as well as the 1-year housing plan information. And so the updates really refer just to the 5-year plan portion of the housing plan. So after the Native Hawaiian Housing Plan is submitted for a fiscal year, DHHL may update the 5-year plan information as necessary in the subsequent years within that 5-year period. However, information for the 1-year plan must be submitted each fiscal year. So it should always be a new 1-year plan that reflects the upcoming 12-month period. When submitting a complete plan, the complete plan must include the 5-year plan portion as well as the 1-year plan. And making amendments to the plan, amendments really reflect new activities that are not addressed in the current Native Hawaiian Housing Plan, which was found by HUD to be in compliance with NAHASDA. So each year that DHHL submits their housing plan to HUD, HUD will review the plan to determine whether all of the information and all of the planned activities that will be used that NHHBG funds will be spent on, HUD needs to determine that all of that is in compliance with NAHASA. Those are all eligible activities that DHHL is allowed to use these grant funds for. But during the year, once HUD determines that housing plan is in compliance, if during that 12-month period, DHHL has the opportunity to amend the plan and add a new activity if they wish to do so. But new activities really are those that are new and not included in any other type of activity category that was already found by HUD to be in compliance with NAHASDA. So uh, amendments are really just restricted to any brand new activity not already included in that plan found in compliance by HUD. Now, this section, 1006.201, talks about eligible affordable housing activities. And what we did is we added some new language to this section, again, for clarification. So the new language says that affordable housing activities must be conducted in accordance with Subpart D of the regulation, which is the program requirements for rental or home ownership housing. So in other words, these are all of in subpart D of the regulation. These are all the different types of program requirements that are triggered when NHHBG funds are used. And so we're just, again, clarifying that any type of housing activity carried out when using NHHBG funds, those activities must be conducted in accordance with program requirements. Now, we have different sections in the regulation that talk about each of the different eligible categories. And so these categories are housing development, housing services, housing management services, crime prevention and safety, and model activities. And so within the parameters of those 5 different categories of eligible activities, we have information that describes examples of activities that would fall under each eligible activity category. So under this section for housing development, we made a revision within one of the examples to align with the regulations in the Indian Housing Block Grant Program. And so the language says that the development and rehabilitation of utilities, necessary infrastructure and utility services. So the language that is highlighted in yellow represents the new language that we added. So this is again to clarify that under housing development, DHHL may use NHHBG funds to not only develop utilities, but also rehabilitate utilities. So this would be when doing the infrastructure development. Normally nowadays, the utilities are all installed underground. So whether it's your electric, cable lines, that sort of stuff. It could be also your water lines, sewer, etc. So NHHBG funds may be used for development and rehabilitation of these utilities, necessary infrastructure, and utility services. Under the section where we describe housing services as eligible activities, we amended this section just for formatting purposes only. So under housing services, we say that NHHBG may be used for housing related services for affordable housing, which may include, and in one part of this language, we removed the words tenant-based rental assistance, and we added it to a new section that we added to this regulation, which is called tenant-based or project-based rental assistance. So we're not saying that NHHBG can no longer be used for tenant-based rental assistance. All we did is we wanted to expand on that explanation of tenant-based rental assistance, and so we created a new section that includes that information. Under this section where we discuss housing management services as an eligible activity, what we did was we added a new paragraph to this section. And so the new language says that the costs of operation and maintenance of units occupied by NHHBG eligible families. So again, under this section, we're describing examples of how NHHBG funds may be used to provide housing management services. And so originally, I believe the language said the costs of operation and maintenance of units developed with NHHBG funds. And as part of the rulemaking process, before we made these final changes, HUD proposed a interim rule notifying the public that HUD is planning to make these changes to the regulation. And then when the interim rule is published in the Federal Register, the public is given 60 days opportunity to provide comments or input or suggestions, or whether they agree or disagree with these proposed changes that HUD says they're going to make. So as part of that public comments, we did receive comment suggesting that instead of limiting this housing management service activity only to units that are developed with NHHBG funds, it was suggested that we expand to be able to pay for costs of operation and maintenance of units, not just developed with NHHBG, but just that are occupied by NHHBG eligible families. Because if that housing unit or building was developed previously using other funds, but they are now being occupied by a family that is eligible to receive NHHBG assistance, then now we can use NHHBG funds to pay for the cost of operation and maintenance of those units. So I think this was a really favorable change, and thanks to that opportunity for public comment, we were able to incorporate that suggestion. So this is a new section, as I mentioned previously, that we added to the regulation, and it's called tenant-based or project-based rental assistance. So we added this new section to clarify that NHHBG may be used to provide both tenant-based rental assistance and project-based rental assistance. And so this is how the language is presented. NHHBG funds may be used for the provision of tenant-based rental assistance, which may include security deposits and first month's rent, and project-based rental assistance. So tenant-based rental assistance, I just want to share information. I don't want to assume that everyone understands, but if you do, please bear with me. So the difference between the two is that with tenant-based rental assistance, that rental assistance stays with the tenant. So one good example of that is someone who has a Section 8 housing choice voucher. That voucher that they hold with them, they can take it to any private landlord and demonstrate that this person is approved to receive some type of rental assistance or subsidy. And so they can take that housing choice voucher to a private landlord and say, Mr. Landlord, I'm applying to rent your home. I get this subsidy from, typically it comes from a government source or some other agency. And that's their proof to the landlord that they get this assistance to help pay their rent. So, and then if that tenant who has that rental assistance voucher decides to move to another housing unit, then that tenant can take that rental assistance with them, and they will be able to get assistance in renting another housing unit somewhere else. With project-based rental assistance, the rental assistance is based with that housing project. And so this may be a subsidized housing project where the tenants maybe still need to meet some type of income limit restriction to be eligible to live in the unit. And they get, some type of rental subsidy that is based in that project. And so if that tenant lives in that project-based assisted unit in that project, they get the rental assistance. But once that tenant moves out of that housing project, they cannot take that assistance with them. And so that's the difference. And so this was also a new definition that we added to the NHHBG regulation. And so for the NHHBG program, project-based rental assistance means rental assistance provided through an agreement for use of a DHHL property or a contract with the owner of an existing structure where the owner agrees to lease the subsidized units to program participants. Program participants will not retain their rental assistance if they move from the project. And then we just have some additional language that rental assistance must comply with the requirements of this part and be provided to eligible families. So similar to what I mentioned earlier, that rental assistance has to be provided in compliance with program requirements. And then also rental assistance may be provided to eligible families both on and off the Hawaiian homelands, provided such use is consistent with the applicable appropriations acts governing the use of NHHBG funds. Now, the reason why this is significant is because when Title 8 to NAHASDA was authorized, which created the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program, it was based on the statutory language that we understood that the NHHBG assistance had to be for housing units located on Hawaiian homelands, whether it's for rental or homeownership. Several years later, after the NHHBG program was already in existence, Congress appropriates funds each year in order to infuse new funds into the NHHBG program to be able to carry out these affordable housing activities. And so if Congress makes funds available to appropriate to the NHHBG program, sometimes Congress will add special language that ties in with that appropriation of funds. And so starting a few years ago, Congress added in language to the appropriation of NHHBG funds, allowing that current new appropriation plus prior year's appropriation of NHHBG funds to be used to provide rental assistance to eligible families, both on and off Hawaiian homelands. So currently, as it stands, NHHBG assistance for homeownership still needs to be for homes that are located on Hawaiian homelands, but rental assistance may be provided to eligible. They still have to be eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. They still need to meet the income limit eligibility criteria, but the rental assistance for those families could be for housing that is located both on or off Hawaiian homelands. So that's the significance of that. Under the section where we talk about administrative and planning costs, we made an amendment just for formatting purposes only. And so in this section, basically the regulation is saying that these are the administrative requirements that apply to the NHHBG program. And so we point to the uniform administrative requirements under another federal regulation called 2 CFR Part 200. And then we also list other federal regulations, for example, I have the list here. So there are federal regulations regarding dealing with lead-based paint issues, the requirement for any entity that receives federal funds, they need to maintain a drug-free workplace. There are administrative requirements with regards to federal grant recipients having an audit done each year if they spend more than a certain amount of federal funds each year. There are other federal requirements with regard to using funds for housing counseling, carrying out housing counseling as part of this federal program, and so on. So these are additional federal requirements that are also applicable to the NHHBG program. And so the original language included pointed to these other federal requirements that are explained further in these other two sections of the NHHBG regulation. And what we did was, because we created a new section, we basically just changed the language. So instead of just referring to those two sections of other federal requirements, we now are referring instead of referring to these two sections, there are now three additional sections of federal requirements. So what we did was we created a new section just to discuss other federal requirements involving displacement, relocation, and acquisition. And so we thought it was easier to read if this long explanation on this federal regulation had its own separate section. So that's why we did that. Now for this section, all we did was change the section heading. Initially, it was called Types of Investments, and we changed the heading to read Types of Investments and Forms of Assistance, because that better describes really what that section is talking about. And what this section talks about is it describes the various forms of assistance for how DHHL may use NHHBG funds to carry out affordable housing activities. And so this is the list of examples. So it talks about equity investments, which is really like when someone owns their home and they have a lot of equity in their property. So whether they have no mortgage or they have a very small mortgage balance, and the value of the property is so where they have this equity in their property, then DHHO could perhaps allow families to tap into that equity of their property along with NHHBG funds. So for example, DHHL uses NHHBG funds to fund loan programs for families to be able to do home rehabilitation. So that would be one type of an example of an equity investment. DHHL could provide assistance in the form of interest-bearing loans or advances. So using their funds to make a loan that charges interest, or it could be a no-interest loan. DHHL could do interest subsidies using their NHHBG funds to do that type of assistance. DHHL could leverage private investments, so leveraging NHHBG funds with other funds to provide housing assistance. Other forms of assistance, if DHHL comes up with other ideas of how they could possibly use their NHHBG funds, and if HUD determines that to be consistent with the purposes of NAHASA, then that would be fine. And then this section also says that DHHO has the right to establish the terms of the assistance that it provides. So, if DHHO wanted to use their grant funds to make a loan to a family, DHHO could determine if they're going to charge interest, what the interest rate would be, and what would be the term of the loan, whether it's just going to be a 10-year loan, 20-year loan, what have you. DHHO has discretion with some of that. Now, in this section where we talk about eligible families, through the changes, we expanded this section for the sake of clarity. I mentioned earlier that the purpose of NHHBG is to provide housing assistance to low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. NAHASDA does allow an exception to that low-income requirement in certain instances. And so we added some new language to the regulation to help clarify some of that. This is the new language here highlighted in yellow. So the exception to the low income requirement, DHHO may provide assistance only for home ownership activities to non-low income Native Hawaiian families. So basically families who are over income is another way to look at it. DHHO may provide assistance, but only through home ownership activities to those families. DHHO must determine and document the need for housing that cannot reasonably be met without NHHBG assistance. So in order for DHHO to assist non-low-income families with home ownership activities, DHHO must determine and document that there is a need for housing for that family that cannot be reasonably met without NHHBG assistance. So that's the new regulatory language there. We have another section that talks about low income requirement and income targeting. And what we did was we expanded this section to clarify when DHHO must determine that the family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. And so this section starts off by saying, in general, housing qualifies as affordable housing, provided the family occupying the unit is low income at the following times. And so based on conversations I've had with DHHL's NAHASDA staff over the years, we came up with this proposed language, and it ended up being published in the final rule. So this explains, depending on the activity that's being done, when DHHL must determine that family is income eligible for the NHHBG assistance. So when you're dealing with rental housing, the family must be income at the time of initial occupancy of that unit. If it's housing for home ownership, the family must be determined low income at the time of purchase. And so through my conversations with DHHO, there are different scenarios dealing with home ownership housing. And so we added this language as well. So I would have had all of this highlighted in yellow. So just know that this is all new language. When DHHO enters into a loan contract with the family for NHHBG assistance to purchase or construct a home ownership unit, time of purchase means when that loan contract is executed. So we felt it was necessary to clarify further what we mean by time of purchase when we're talking about housing for home ownership. When we're dealing with owner-occupied housing, then that owner-occupied family must be determined low income at the time the family receives NHHBG assistance. If it's a lease purchase agreement, this is also like a rent to own or rent with option to purchase situation. Then the family, if it's for existing housing or housing to be constructed, then the family must be determined low income at the time that lease purchase agreement is signed. And if the NHHBG funds are being used to provide emergency assistance, and this would be to prevent homelessness or foreclosure, then the family must be determined low income at the time the family receives the NHHBG assistance. We have a section now, it's a new section called Income Verification for Receipt of NHHBG Assistance. And this section was added to explain DHHL's responsibility regarding documenting income eligibility. And so again, for clarification, we wanted to make sure that this would help support DHHL to administer a rental housing or rental assistance program. And so what this says is at initial determination of eligibility, DHHL must verify income eligibility and collect documentation to verify this determination. And then DHHL, of course, must maintain this documentation. And we do have a a records retention requirement, and so DHHL must adhere to that as well. For any type of periodic verification, DHHL may require a family to periodically verify its income to determine housing payments or continued occupancy if that is consistent with DHHL's written policies. So of course, DHHL must determine initially whether that family is income eligible to receive assistance. And then once that family has been determined eligible, they're in the unit and they're getting their rental assistance, it's up to DHHL if they want to require that family to go through subsequent periodic verifications. And then if so, DHHL would have to describe that in their written policies and then implement any periodic verification in accordance with their written policies. Now, this is also a new section that we added, and it talks about non-low income families. We added this new section to discuss families that were low income at determination of income eligibility, but subsequently becomes non-low income. So a family that was low income at the times described in that previous slide where I was talking about families, getting homeownership assistance or families getting rental assistance or families in a lease purchase agreement. So a family that was low income at those times described, but subsequently becomes non-low income, meaning their income increases. So now that they're over the 80% of area median income, because for us, this is the low income determination. So if they subsequently become non-low income, they may continue to participate in the program in accordance with DHHL's admissions and occupancy policies. We do have a requirement in a new section under 1006-301 where DHHL may use up to 10% of the amount planned to be spent in its Native Hawaiian housing plan for its fiscal year. DHHL may use up to 10% of that budgeted amount for families who are at 81% to 100% of AMI, adjusted area median income, without HUD approval. And so that this 10% limitation shall not apply to these families who were initially low income and later became non-low income. These families, though, may be subject to additional requirements that are discussed in section 1006.301. The additional requirements are non-low income families that may be assisted cannot receive the same benefits that are provided to low-income families. The amount of assistance will be determined by DHHL as established in its written policies. So what this means is, as I mentioned before, this NHHBG program is really primarily designed to assist low-income families. But DHHL does have can make an exception to assist non-low income families. But if DHHL decides to assist a non-low income family, that non-low income family cannot receive that same level of benefits that would have been received by a low income family. And so what we're saying here is these families who were initially low income when they were assisted and then later become an over income family, those families could be subject to these additional requirements based on DHHL's admission and occupancy policy. So this is where DHHL has some discretion. Now in this section where we talk about rent and lease purchase limitations, we revised this section to clarify rent and lease purchase payments. And so again, lease purchase is really situations where it's a rent to own or rent with option to purchase type of housing situation. And those lease purchase payments are referred to as home ownership or home buyer payments in the NHHBG regulation. So that sometimes can cause confusion. So please understand that if you see this term home buyer payments, when we're really talking about rents, the home buyer payments means those lease purchase or rent to own payments during the rental period of the housing. And so the yellow highlight language represents where the revisions were made. So we have a paragraph that talks about maximum and minimum rent that can be charged. The maximum monthly tenant rent payment for a low-income family may not exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. So that's always been a requirement under this program. But what we did was we clarified the language, because initially all it said was the maximum monthly rent for a low-income family may not exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. But really what it means is the tenant rent payment. So the tenant's portion of their rent payment cannot exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. And so if you're in a situation where the rent is $500 and the tenant's portion of the rent payment is $200, that $200 of the tenant's rent payment cannot exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. So DHHO would calculate what is 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income, and determine then that the tenant rent payment amount cannot exceed that amount. And then the balance would be subsidized by the rental assistance program. DHHO may compute on any lesser percentage of the family's monthly adjusted income. So in other words, this is the maximum percentage that can determine the tenant's portion of the rent payment. But if DHHO wanted to, they could allow the family to only pay, say, 20% or 10% of their monthly adjusted income and then subsidize the rest. So this is the maximum, but if DHHO wanted to compute less, they could. Just as a note, NAHASDA does not set minimum rent or home buyer payments. However, DHHO may do so. So this is very typical under NAHASDA, Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. HUD provides parameters within the statute and the regulation. And then within those parameters, DHHO may still have a certain extent of flexibility or discretion on how they want to craft their programs or their housing assistance programs. And so whenever it says DHHO may, then that's where DHHO has some flexibility or discretion within the program requirement. And then we have this new section that describes flat or income adjusted rent. Flat rent means the tenant's rent payment is set at a specific dollar amount or a specific percentage of market rent. Income adjusted rent means the tenant's rent payment varies based on the tenant's income. It's like, as the example here, 30% of monthly adjusted income. DHHO may charge flat or income adjusted rents. And we always tell DHHO they should have written policies in place for any type of program they're creating to use NHHBG funds for. And so wherever, again, as I say, where DHHO may do this or do that, as long as they have it established in their written policies, how they're going to proceed and implement, then they just need to ensure that they carry out their programs in compliance with their written policies or in accordance with their written policies. We also have a new paragraph under this section for utilities, where we explain that utilities may be considered a part of rent or homebuyer payments if DHHO decides to define rent or homebuyer payments to include utilities in its written policies. DHHO may define it to exclude utilities. So again, we're just telling DHHO, this is what you can do, and you can decide if you want to do it or not. Okay, so a lot of this kind of goes into further explanation. Again, right, one of the purposes of these changes was to better explain how NHHBG funds may be used to provide rental housing assistance. So this is a fine example of one of those scenarios. I mentioned earlier that we created a new section for under 1006.377, but under this section, 1006.375, we revised this section, removed displacement and relocation, and added section 3 on debarment. And so in the earlier slide, I had a whole list of all identifying all the other federal requirements that we're referring to when we talk about other federal requirements that are applicable to the NHHBG program. So after the NHHBG regulations were created in 2002, either these were new requirements or it was just requirements that were applicable to the NHHBG, but for some reason were forgot to be mentioned in the earlier version of the regulation. And so for clarification, we added to make it known that these other federal requirements do apply to the NHHBG program. And so now they are listed, these additional federal requirements are listed at section 1006.375. And then although we removed displacement and relocation as the other federal requirement listed in this section, we created a new section that discusses the other federal requirement of displacement, relocation, and acquisition. Under this section where it talks about performance reports, this pertains to an annual performance report that DHHO is required to submit to HUD each year. We revised this section so that it aligns with the Indian Housing Block Grant Regulation. So initially, the NHHBG regulation said that DHHO must submit an annual performance report within 60 days of the end of its fiscal year. And after 2002, when the NHHBG regulation was initially created, the IHBG program revised their submission deadline. But as I mentioned earlier, some of those amendments that were made to IHBG were never made to the NHHBG program. So with this final rule, we went ahead and made the NHHBG program consistent with the IHBG program. So now DHHL can submit their annual performance report within 90 days instead of the initial 60-day deadline, within 90 days at the end of their fiscal year. And this performance report describes DHHL's conclusions of its review of how they performed during the year, to describe the progress made in achieving their goals and accomplishments that they had planned to do in their housing plan. So the housing plan describes what DHHL plans to do in the upcoming 12-month period. And then when that 12-month period ends, DHHL needs to prepare an actual performance report or an annual performance report that describes the actual accomplishments based on what they had planned to do. Now, although we prescribe a 90-day deadline for DHHO to submit their performance report to HUD, DHHO may submit a written request to extend that deadline if they need an extension, and it'll be up to HUD to determine whether they will approve that request for extension or not. And if we do, then HUD will establish what the new deadline is to submit that performance report. I'm getting towards the end of my presentation. So that summarizes all of the changes that we made through this final rule. And so this slide is just some additional information. I wanted to briefly explain what is the difference between statutory and regulatory requirements. So again, statute means law, and the law in this case is NAHASDA, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. The law cannot be waived. The law cannot be changed. Only Congress can change the law. So only if Congress enacts any changes to NAHASDA and thus, Congress enacts an amendment to NAHASDA, that would be the only way that anything in the current law would be changed. Now, the regulation is the rules to implement the law. So in our case, the regulation is at 24 CFR Part 1006. Now, DHHO may submit a request because regulations, if regulations can be waived, and this is where we say in the NHHBG regulation, in this section 1006.30, it talks about waivers. Upon determination of good cause, HUD may, subject to statutory limitations, waive any provision of Part 1006. Waiver requests must be submitted to HUD in writing. And generally, this should be the exception, not the norm. So again, I just wanted to take a few minutes to explain that nothing in the statute can be waived, but it is possible to waive regulatory requirements. DHHO would have to submit that request for waiver to HUD in writing, and then HUD will determine whether it can approve that request for waiver or not. And those requests for waivers really should be when DHHO really feels, that it's important to request that waiver. It's not something that should just be submitted willy-nilly. Okay, I saw there were a couple of questions in the chat, and that is where we're at right now. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions now. Lehua, would you like to read out?
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
thank
just
you.
so that we at least have the presentation portion. So thank you for that. So I'm going to stop that right now.
Okay.
There we go.